Mr. Oberberg, if you're ready to move on to the next presentation.
Yes, we are. Mr. Jeff Gazzetti from the Office of Aviation Safety will give the next presentation for the issue area, Improve the Safety of Emergency Medical Services Flights.
Good morning. I'm here to talk about that issue. It's a relatively new issue that the board put on the most wanted list at its last most wanted list board meeting, to improve the safety of emergency medical services flights. This issue area was born out of the findings from a special investigation report on EMS operations that the board adopted back in 2006. That report recognized that EMS aviation operations are an important service to the public by transporting seriously ill patients and donor organs to emergency care facilities. But there are pressures and challenges with that flight assignment, and some of those have resulted in accidents, and they continue to result in accidents. In the 2006 report, analysis of 55 accidents indicated that 29 of them could have been prevented with corrective actions that were identified in the report. So as a result, the board issued 4 recommendations to improve EMS safety. Before I get into those 4 recommendations, I would like to quickly update the board on what's happened recently in this area, specifically with helicopter EMS safety, or HEMS. After we issued the 4 recommendations in 2006, the number of fatal HEMS accidents seemed to decrease until 2008, which was the deadliest year for the HEMS industry. That year, there were 8 fatal HEMS accidents, killing a total of 29 people for calendar year 2008. These accidents, along with the board's previous concerns with EMS safety, prompted the board to conduct a 4-day public hearing, and that occurred 1 year ago this month, on the safety of HEMS operations. The hearing gathered testimony from 41 expert witnesses and addressed the topics such as business models, safety equipment, training, flight operations, and oversight. As a result of that hearing and the investigation from the recent fatal accidents, the board issued 21 additional recommendations this past October. 10 of them were issued to the FAA, 5 to public aircraft operators, 2 to the Federal Interagency Committee on EMS, or FICOMS, and 4 to the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. And I also would mention that we also had a standalone accident report on the Maryland State Police helicopter accidents, and there were 9 additional ones in addition to these 21 ones. So there's been a lot of activity in this area. But since these recommendations that I've just mentioned were issued less than 5 months ago, staff felt it would be premature to place them on the most wanted list under this topic area at this time. However, staff strongly believes that the 4 EMS recommendations that were issued in 2006 should remain on the list. The first of these 4 recommendations is A0612. While carrying patients or organs for transplant, EMS flights are required to be conducted in accordance with the operator's Part 135 operation specifications, or what's known as OPS specs. However, when flights are conducted without patients on board, which are positioning flights, they're permitted to operate under Part 91 rules, which are less stringent. The board found that many accidents could have been prevented if the flights were conducted under the more stringent Part 135 regulations. And as a result, the board issued a recommendation to the FAA to require all EMS operators to comply with Part 135 OPS specs during the conduct of all flights where you had medical personnel on board. In November 2008, the FAA published an OPS spec, A021, to specify that if a flight or a sequence of flights even includes a 135 segment, then all visual flight rule segments of the flight must be conducted within much more stringent predefined altitude and weather minimums derived from pre-flight planning for that flight. And according to the FAA, as of February of last year, 100% of all HEMS operators are in compliance with that OPS spec. Staff feels that this is a very positive step. The OPS spec actually has even more rigorous standards than the typical 135 weather minimums. However, in order to fully satisfy the safety recommendation, the FAA still must require the Part 135 flight and duty time limitations for all EMS flights, and no progress has been made in that area in terms of the flight and duty time limitations. So the status of this recommendation is open, unacceptable response. The second recommendation, Much of the EMS mission has associated risks, as I indicated previously. As a result, the board issued a recommendation to the FAA to require all EMS operators to develop and implement a flight risk evaluation program that includes training all employees involved in the operation, procedures that support the systemic evaluation of flight risks, and consultation with others trained in EMS flight operations to determine if the risks reach a predefined level. The FAA incorporated the contents of a notice that had an excellent risk assessment program into an FAA order for their inspectors to use when surveilling EMS operations. But it's still not a requirement. The FAA still has not required that EMS operators conduct a flight risk assessment prior to their flights. Now, in April of 2009, the FAA did initiate formal rulemaking to address this issue, as well as several other issues identified by the Safety Board. The FAA has indicated that they intend to require, by way of this new rule, that EMS operators conduct a flight risk assessment prior to their flight. Again, staff is very pleased that this rulemaking effort has been initiated and that the vast majority of HEMS operators are adhering to this recommendation already, but we're concerned that the requirements coming out of a rulemaking effort will take too long to become a reality. This new rulemaking effort has been in the works for nearly a year now, and we haven't seen much progress in that. So we propose that the status of this recommendation remain as open, unacceptable response. The third recommendation involves flight dispatch. Staff's investigations revealed that many EMS operators lack a consistent, comprehensive flight dispatch procedure that would help EMS pilots determine whether to accept a flight assignment. As a result, the board issued a recommendation to the FAA to require EMS operators to use formalized dispatch and flight following procedures that include up-to-date weather information and assistance in flight risk assessment decisions. In May 2008, the FAA published an advisory circular on this topic, and it provides a list of tasks that should be completed by operational control centers, or OCCs. And according to an FAA survey, 89% of all HEMS operators have operational control centers. That survey is a year old. I suspect that that has gone up because an advisory circular is, it's just short of a requirement, but it's a pretty well-written and powerful circular that operators must show equivalency to. We feel this is good progress, and the staff recommends that this recommendation continue to be classified as open, acceptable response. Finally, the 2006 investigation revealed that 17 of the 55 accidents cited in the report could have been avoided with terrain awareness warning systems, or TAWS. That may have helped the pilot avoid terrain. In fact, some of the 2008 fatal accidents also may have been prevented with TAWS. The FAA has already recognized the benefit of TAWS by requiring them on turbine-powered airplanes with 6 or more passenger seats, yet this has not been extended to EMS helicopters. As a result, the board issued a recommendation to require EMS operators to install TAWS on their helicopters and aircraft to provide adequate training to ensure that flight crews are capable of using the systems to safely conduct EMS operations. RTCA developed standards. The FAA published a technical standard order in December of 2008. And again, the FAA intends to require TAWS in its new rulemaking effort. We're very pleased with that, but very little progress has been made in regard to publishing this rule. Therefore, staff proposes that the issue remain classified as open, unacceptable response. That completes my comments. We're prepared to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you for that very comprehensive presentation. Member Sumwall.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chairman. And I think the staff, since we had our last most wanted list board meeting, staff has done an awful lot of good things in this area. Like you mentioned, Mr. Gazzetti putting on the 4-day public hearing on this topic. As a result of that, issuing the 21 safety recommendations, and then the District Heights accident where we issued an additional 9 recommendations. So staff has done a lot of very good work in that period of time. Regarding the OPSPEC A021, you mentioned that that's a step in the right direction because it does address it does address at least half of safety recommendation A0612, which was for the HIMS operators, for the EMS operators to operate all legs in accordance with Part 135. So it will take care of the weather part of that, but not the hours of service part of that.
That's correct.
Is the FAA, have they indicated that they plan to do anything in the area of the hours of service part of that?
Yes, they did make a reference in our response, in their last response, that they plan on addressing hours of service again in this new rulemaking that's dedicated to EMS operations.
I think that we have a job of putting the pressure on, putting pressure to bear on agencies, and I think we do a good job of that. But I also want to be fair to the modal agency, and I have been one to call it the way I see it. When they're not doing what we think they should, I don't mind saying that. That's what we're here for. I'm wondering, to be fair to the FAA, if this recommendation status should actually be open, acceptable response, because they have made, as you said, a significant, I'm not sure if you use the word significant, but in my way of looking at it, this A021 was a sizable undertaking, and I'm wondering if that would be more appropriate to give them the credit for the work that they have done. So it's a question to staff, really.
Well, I will tell you that we've been wrestling with that. I would agree with you that I guess it's certainly for the helicopter EMS industry, the big killer was the weather issues. And this OPSPEC, as I indicated, is actually, in many regards, more rigid than the Part 135 weather minimums. The reason that the board made the recommendation for the generic Part 135 for EMS operations is because not only was weather a concern for the helicopters, but fatigue was a factor in a King Air airplane accident where the pilot was on Part 91 time and then got into a King Air and had flown for many hours because there's no hours of limitations for 91, and then fell asleep basically on an approach to Dodge City, Kansas in an airplane. To my knowledge, we have yet to classify any helicopter EMS accident either as causal or contributory with fatigue. So I think that there is an argument that can be made that fatigue has not been a player with the helicopter community, and that would lend some food for thought on what you're saying about this.
I had wondered if we did have any fatigue-related helicopter EMS accidents. And to be clear, you did come into my office yesterday and tell me what the proposed status of each of these were, and I said I agree with you. But through your presentation, when you pointed out AO21, and you did indicate that this is a step in the right direction, it did cause me to think, they have done a lot. They've basically satisfied and gone further than we asked for in our weather area. So I look forward to the discussions with my colleagues. At this point, I am inclined to say that we should give them the credit for what they've done there and say acceptable response. But on the other ones, unfortunately, we haven't seen the progress that we'd like to see. And I sat on April the 22nd, I was sitting right next to the FAA official when we both testified to Congress that he said that they would be, I've got his testimony right here, that he said we recognize that relying on voluntary compliance alone is not enough to ensure safe flight operations. In that regard, the FAA has initiated a formal rulemaking project that will address many of the HIMS initiatives and best practices put forth in the advisory circulars, orders, and notices issued over the last several years, as well as the most recent revision to the OPSPEC. The FAA Rulemaking Council has been given approval to begin drafting a notice of proposed rulemaking, which we are aiming to have published by late 2009 or early 2010. It's still early 2010, but I've seen these things be promised, and then we wait and we wait and we wait. Do we have any indication when the NPRM will be issued on this proposed rulemaking?
We queried the FAA on this issue, and there's a process by which an NPRM is issued, and from what we gather, it hasn't left the first step of that process yet, which is it hasn't left the FAA executive review and gone to the Office of the Secretary of Transportation. And it's been a year. So once we learned that, we felt that they're certainly not going to meet those deadlines. Well, they haven't met them.
Yes, and once the NPRM comes out, then there's another couple of years before the rule becomes final, if it ever does. So my inclination at this point is to leave at least two of those as unacceptable response, the one dealing with TAWS and the flight risk evaluation, those two. But I'm sort of inclined, as I said, to listen to the debate with my colleagues and perhaps say open acceptable response on AO 612, and just see what happens there. But thank you very much for the benefit of collaborating with you here right now so I could better understand these issues.
Thank you, Member Sumwalt. Vice Chairman Hart.
Thank you for that fine presentation. I just had a question about the TAWS survey that the FAA issued in January 2009. The draft report says that the FAA principal operations inspectors conducted a survey of the 74 HIMSS operators, and that the survey revealed that 41% were planning to equip with HTAWS. It wasn't clear to me whether that meant, I'm on page 18 of the draft report, it wasn't clear to me whether that meant 41% of the respondees or 41% of the total population of 74.
My understanding is it's the total population of the 74.
Oh, okay. That's helpful. Okay, that's the only question I had.
And again, that was 41% of those planning either have installed or planning to install.
Well, then tell me again what the reason is for the unacceptable on the TAWS recommendation.
The FAA is not requiring HTAWS on EMS helicopters. They are indicating that the rulemaking will have that requirement in it,
Okay.
but their rulemaking hasn't seen the light of day yet.
Okay, thank you.
And also, I'd like to mention, we've had 3 fatal accidents in the last 6 months, and all 3 of those helicopters did not have HTAWS on them.
I'll go ahead and follow up on that issue. How many of those 3 operators conducted a risk assessment before the flight departed? None of them had HTAWS. How many conducted a risk assessment?
That's right. None of them had HTAWS. It's interesting, though, that 2 out of the 3 had a risk assessment procedure. One, we're trying to verify how robust the procedure is. As you know, they might say, well, we've got a risk assessment, but one that just happened in El Paso, we're trying to determine just how robust that was. The 2 others that had a risk assessment, the Doyle, California, and Georgetown, South Carolina, all 3 of these are ongoing investigations. Those 2, we did see a risk assessment check sheet, but the investigation is still determining just how well it was followed and how well it was used. So in that regard, so far, all 3 of those had that.
Okay. Can you explain to me why they were able to publish the revision to the op specs AO21 to require the weather minimums, but not address the duty time issue? What authority did they have to get the weather that they couldn't use that to also address the fatigue issue?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Chairman Hersman. I think there's some legal issue involved with that I just can't answer. There is an issue about regulating through op specs. There are some things you just simply can't do through op specs. There are other things that you can do. And the FAA felt that this op spec A021 that dealt with flight planning and weather was something that fell within the realm of being able to require via op spec, but I don't know why they couldn't do that with the flight and duty times.
Do you have any thoughts? Okay. Does anybody else have any thoughts why they felt like they could do it by op spec in this one area but not in another? I think that it's always a perplexing issue. I think whether or not they put out guidance or whether or not they address something through an ops spec or they have to go through the regulatory activity, I think there is a recognition that requiring something certainly does make it more difficult. I think the reason, though, we were very straight on requiring things is when we issued these recommendations in 2006, we had a lot of promises that people were doing things voluntarily, and I think our problem is we saw in 2008, and then we've got a number of accidents that are still under investigation, that there were people who were not doing these things voluntarily, or if they were doing them, they weren't to the standard that we were hoping for. And so I think that's our challenge. The other concern that I have is this issue with the surveying people and talking about their intent. It's a little bit like what we talked about in Colgan with FOQA programs, and I'm not real comfortable with a promise or a verbal commitment to do something. I really do feel like they've got to get these regulatory actions completed, because I think as Member Sumwalt and the team that worked on the public hearing saw, there are a lot of operators who are going to voluntarily implement risk assessments, do it well. They're going to put new equipment on board their aircraft. They're going to raise the bar on safety. Those are not the operators that we're worried about. It's the ones who are not going to do this unless they're forced to. Those are the ones that we're concerned about, and you're not going to get those people unless you have minimum standards or minimum requirements, and they're picked up by those. So it sounded like Member Sumwalt had a proposal. What does staff think about leaving that acceptable?
In general, the staff is favorable to Member Sumwalt's idea.
Okay. Is there any more discussion from the board members? Vice Chairman Hart?
The AO21, the 6A612 says require all EMS operators to comply with 14 CFR 135. The AO21 sounded like it addressed only the weather minimums part. I just wondered, what about other aspects of 135 operations? To what extent are they addressed?
It did not. The 2006 study focused on 135 in two aspects: flight and duty time and weather minimums. There are other 135 versus 91 differences, like maintenance, for example. But we didn't find an issue with maintenance out of the 2006 study. So even though there are other components of 135, the board's intent was weather minimums and flight and duty time, and we spelled that out in the narratives leading up to that, the 135 recommendation.
So then that's what the chairman was referring to, is that AO21 referred to one of those but not the other?
That's correct.
I see. Okay, thank you. That clarifies it for me.
And AO21 only applies to HEMS operators. Is that correct?
No. AO21, I think, was at the time all EMS operators, but I think by default, see, that's the TAWS one. Is that correct? The FAA's already required it for the turbine airplanes. So, and since all EMS airplanes are, well, I take that back.
In the write-up, it says in 08, FAA published the revised op spec AO21, and then at the end it says, as of February 2009, all HEMS operators have complied with this op spec.
Yes.
So my question is, who does it apply to? Just HEMS or everyone?
HEMS operators, I'm sorry.
Does it apply to everyone?
No, just helicopter EMS operations.
Okay. Do we have concerns about weather minimums for fixed wing?
We do not.
Okay, so in essence, they've addressed half of the recommendation.
That's correct.
Through this op spec?
Yes.
Okay. And if something's in an op spec, it's required to be complied with, so it's almost as good as a regulation, unless the industry decides to challenge it and they have to pull it back.
That's
okay.
my understanding.
Okay. Is there a motion? Is there any additional discussion?
Do we have any indication one way or the other whether they have any intention of addressing other aspects of 135 beyond the weather minimums?
I'm fairly confident that they do not intend to address other issues in that regard through an OPSPEC, other than the rulemaking that, which they'd like to address, require TAWS and flight risk assessment, and there's no interim.
I'm sorry, Mr. Gazzetti, are you saying that there's no indication that they're going to address the flight and duty time issue?
Yes, in the rulemaking, they stated in passing that they are going to address that issue in the new rule. The flight and duty
They are
time.
anticipating addressing it?
Yes.
Okay, all right. Do we have a motion?
Madam Chairman, I'd like to begin by proposing that we accept. Well, it's nice to think about what you're going to say before you say it.
Member Summerall, I might suggest, if I think I know where you're going, that you'd like to reclassify A0612 first?
Well, actually, it is not. Yes, that is right. Thanks. Let's, Madam Chairman, I recommend I make a proposal, or I move that we reclassify A06-12 from open unacceptable response to open acceptable response, and that is my motion.
Second. Is there discussion?
Just to say that staff understands what the point Member Summerall was making, and we're comfortable with that.
I think it's important to send a positive message when there's positive action taken, and so I would support this. I think, though, that we need to understand if they don't address the flight and duty time issue, will we then be comfortable with closing this recommendation if they accomplish but half of it? And so I think that that's a longer-term discussion for us to be aware of, but I believe that our recommendation was comprehensive and included all of the issues, but they're showing progress, and so I'm comfortable with where we are now. Any other discussion? All in favor of Member Summerall's motion, signal with the hand and aye. Aye. The ayes have it. The recommendation has been reclassified to an acceptable status. Do we have another motion for the issue area?
Madam Chairman, I propose that the issue area of improve safety of emergency medical services flights remain on the most wanted list, and that the timeliness designation remain classified as red.
Second that motion for purposes of discussion. I'd just like to ask Danielle, what, on your majority rule about the majority being, what does that mean when it's half?
There is no board order guidance for that, and I think, to be honest, that we would defer to the board to choose between yellow and green is out, but you can choose between yellow and red.
So it's not automatic in any case?
No.
Okay, thank you.
I'm comfortable with your motion. If you want to change it, you can amend it.
So I think that, yes, I'm comfortable leaving, that was my motion, that the timeliness designation remain red to indicate that we feel like it's not moving in a timely fashion.
Okay. All those in favor signal with the hand and aye. 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 The ayes have it. The issue has been retained on the most wanted list with a designation of red. I apologize to the audience. I think we had hoped to get through the aviation issues and then break for lunch. We have some business that we need to address that we're going to go ahead and take the lunch break now, and then we'll reconvene and continue with the rest of the issues. It's about 11:50. We'll be back to begin at 1 o'clock.